Supah Ritz, Volume 2, From the Ashes. One of the many lessons my parents had drilled into my head before I lit out for Hollywood was that it was easier to get a job if you had a job, and you should never quit your first job until you had your second job lined up. I had really tried to find a new job before leaving William Morris, but it hadn't panned out. Job opportunities came streaming across my computer screen several times a week, sometimes several times a day, when I was sitting on Rick Hess's desk. A director would be looking for an assistant. A writer would be looking for an assistant. An actor would be looking for a girl Friday. And when you're in the terrifying frenzy of trying to find a phone number for Arnold Rifkin while he hovers over your desk, that impatient scowl making even the most resilient of sphincters falter, any job seemed better. But after surviving a full year at William Morris, I didn't want any job. I wanted the right job. And when it didn't present itself in my remaining weeks at the agency, I had little choice but to buck my parents' wisdom, pack my desk, and join the ranks of the unemployed. After all, I still had my William Morris network to rely on, and I called in to a different assistant every day to shake the trees. But finding the kind of job opportunity I was looking for proved harder than I thought. I was looking for a kingmaker, because it seemed to me that the hardest leap to make in Hollywood was the one that took you from being the assistant on someone else's desk to having a desk of your own. While the process was clearly not a meritocracy, it wasn't a lottery either. There were ways to get ahead, and the one I identified was to simply go work as the assistant for someone who could promote you themselves. They didn't have to ask someone above them for permission, because there was no one above them. They were at the top, and they could just promote you on a whim, or because they felt they owed you, or they felt it was a promotion you had earned. Those guys, it seemed, were always looking for assistants. In part, it was because they were always promoting people, but also, those jobs were tough. If you didn't get promoted, you got fired. Scott Rudin was probably the most notorious of these bosses. He allegedly threw one guy out of his car on the way to the airport. Just made him get out on the side of the highway because he had fucked something up. He made a friend of mine get his ears examined because he couldn't believe my friend could possibly be so stupid. It had to be something else, like his hearing. Now that's commitment to a bit. But he was also known to promote the assistants who survived. And you could go from working as Scott's assistant to president of production in a matter of years. If you made it through the journey, the whole town viewed you with a certain kind of awe. You had proved, if nothing else, you had the grit to survive. Hollywood respected that. I believed I could endure the degradation of an abusive boss if it meant passage out of the land of assistanthood. I believed it would be worth every humiliating moment, and I was willing to hold out for that opportunity, for a quick climb to the top. Thankfully, my parents had sent me off to Hollywood with a $5,000 check in my pocket, and despite my meager William Morris earnings, I still had most of that money intact. Rents were cheap in LA back then, and I was collecting unemployment. My only substantial expense was the $250 COBRA payment I had to pay for my health insurance policy that rolled over from WMA. It seemed an outrageous sum for a guy who could treat most of his ills with the timely application of a fifth of gin. Still, I figured I could hold out a little while before I started selling myself on Hollywood Boulevard. But after a couple weeks of frustrated searching, I decided to take a break from the job hunt and go to New York with my girlfriend. We were there for a party some friends from boarding school were throwing, and we stayed at our friend Anne's place downtown. She shared an apartment with 3 or 4 roommates, and one of them was traveling, so we crashed in her room, a kind of hallway space that had a bed wedged inside it. It was an actually okay apartment by New York City standards, but it reminded me how lucky I was to live in LA with our cathedral ceilings and outdoor spaces. It was further evidence I could never have survived in New York. My mother, it turned out, was also in New York at the time of the party, and I decided to pay her a surprise visit. Wasps, by the way, detested surprise. She and my stepfather had a small apartment at the Carlyle Hotel on the Upper East Side. The Carlyle was iconic back then. Gordon Gekko dropped its name in Oliver Stone's Wall Street, but I'd only spent a couple nights in the apartment myself. The one time I stayed there had been when I was in boarding school and came to meet my parents in New York over Thanksgiving break. I arrived a day or so ahead of them, got to the apartment, and immediately called up room service to order myself a burger and fries. But when the meal came to my room, I didn't know how to tip. I didn't realize you could just add the tip to the total and charge it to the room. I thought to cover the tip, you had to pay in cash. After a single meal and one 20% gratuity, Carlisle was expensive as fuck even back then, I was out of money. I didn't dare order more food because I couldn't cover the tip. I just sat up there in that glamorous 2-bedroom apartment, praying my parents would show up soon. I'm probably one of the few people to spend 24 hours at the famed Carlyle Hotel and practically starve. The lobby to the Carlyle was pretty discreet, perhaps the reason it appealed to so many celebrities. I picked up the phone, mind you, we are still pre-cell phones, and called up to my parents' place. I'm in the lobby, I told my mother, and I could feel her immediately tense up at the other end of the line. What about your job, she asked, instantly aware that if I was still at William Morris, there was no way I'd be in New York on a Monday. I quit, I told her. I could hear her exasperated, long-suffering sigh. Well, she said resignedly, you better come up and sit down and talk with me and John. It was like I was getting called into the dean's office for a scolding, but the truth is, I was ready for it. One of the reasons I had gone to Hollywood in the first place was because I believed it was an industry where it would be okay for me to fail. Most of my friends from Georgetown were headed to Wall Street after graduation, and it was the path a lot of kids I grew up with were already on. My own brother was just wrapping up his first job as an analyst at Citibank Venture Capital, the elite private equity shop run by the holy madman of finance, Bill Comfort. My brother had done well there. Bill loved him, and I had already spoken to Mr. Comfort, as he was known to me, about taking over my brother's spot. But I was dreading it. All I knew about finance I'd learned from Liar's Poker, and it sounded awful to me. It scared me, too. I didn't believe I could survive the chest-thumping, wedgie-giving, relentless dick-measuring culture that seemed to be the essence of corporate finance. Plus, I partied like a maniac every time I was in New York back then, stumbling, puking out of the subway at 6 a.m. I believed if I went into finance, I would likely be dead from a drug overdose by the time I was 26. At the very least, I'd be quickly fired, and I didn't think I could handle that level of humiliation. Sure, people got fired from finance jobs all the time, but it felt like it would be worse for me. Finance was my family's realm. My dad had been a banker. All the dads I knew growing up were bankers. My stepfather had bankers clamoring all day for his business. It would not have been hard for me to find a job working at a bank. In fact, there was every reason to believe I should have a successful career in finance. So it felt like it would be an especially poor reflection of my character if I washed out of it. I hated the idea of having to come home to my family to explain my failure and beg them for help finding another job. Even in success, I imagined soliciting their advice and relying on them for guidance through a career and money. I hated that. I hated the idea that they would have standing to second-guess my choices, that I would still find myself returning home to a barrage of unsolicited advice. I longed to escape the scrutinous judgment of the parental gaze. Also, when I did the math, finance didn't seem like it was going to pay out. Sure, if I did well on Wall Street, I'd likely end up with a perfect house in the countryside with my perfect wife and my country club membership and my kids. But I already had that life, and it didn't seem like it would make me happy. In fact, it didn't seem like it was making anyone happy. Wall Street seemed to me like a means to an end, but an end I just wasn't interested in achieving. There was nothing left in that life for me to discover. I wanted my life to be a big, exciting adventure, one I was eager to devour. I couldn't get that if I was playing it safe, worrying about what my parents thought, worrying about what might happen if I didn't succeed. My dread of the long slog ahead had made my stomach go sour for much of the spring of my senior year. It wasn't just all the beer. Hello, keg drinking contest. My team won that shit, by the way, the single greatest achievement of my college career. I was dreading my future. It felt joyless and bleak. But then I found myself taking a screenwriting course taught by the iconic John Glavin at Georgetown University. He would, over time, develop a cultish following. Google him. He taught John Mulaney, Mike Birbiglia, Zalbat Monglish, and Britt Marling, to name a few. Oh, and Nick Morton. In his screenwriting course, we studied 5 existing movies, and using the craft Glavin had taught us, rewrote them to make them better. It was playful. It was collaborative. It was fun. At the end of the semester, Glavin brought in an agent from Los Angeles to tell us how to sell our screenplays in Hollywood. I didn't even know what an agent was. But when someone asked him how he became an agent, he told his story. He had been a student at Georgetown on his way to Wall Street, and he had been dreading it. My antenna perked up. This was me he was talking about. He had a friend working in Hollywood, and he decided to forgo a life of finance to go to Los Angeles, sleep on his friend's couch, and get a job working as an assistant at one of the talent agencies. He worked his way up from there. Eureka, I thought. I can do that. I felt a kind of energy course through my body. It was a cross between fear and excitement, driven by the dawning awareness of my own agency as I realized I could choose a life of my own making. It's a feeling I now poke around for whenever I'm contemplating a major project. It's a feeling I've encouraged my kids to seek out. Does it scare you? Do you want it enough that you're willing to risk failure and humiliation to attain it? I got that feeling when I first ran for student government in the 8th grade. I got it when I started doing stand-up. And I got it when I first had this idea that I might try to have a career in a business I knew nothing about. Hollywood. I started floating this career path idea around the tap at keg parties on campus, and it became clear to me pretty quick that I was for real. When school wrapped up, I headed north to see my parents. I sat in their cozy sitting room in the old Wanamaker mansion, their gargantuan house in Southampton they had restored from a veritable garbage pit. I told them I didn't want to go to Wall Street. I wanted to go to Hollywood. It made a certain kind of sense on paper. It was a business, a real business, but it was also a creative business, and I had been a pretty creative guy. I wasn't telling them I wanted to be an artist or go off and write poetry or novels. I was claiming I wanted to be a producer and make big, expensive Hollywood blockbusters. I suspect they knew better, that deep in my heart I was always going to be a writer, but I wasn't really sure at that point myself. Hollywood, my mother asked. She seemed more bemused than alarmed. We don't know anyone in Hollywood. There are so many things you could do, she went on to explain, that we could help you with, but Hollywood isn't one of them. And really, that was exactly the point. Of course, that also turned out to not be entirely true. I am on some level a Hollywood animal. I love meeting people, going to parties, making connections, and fanning a spark into a burning flame. I must get that from somewhere. After a scant week on the Hamptons party circuit, my mother had secured meetings for me with Marty Bregman, the producer of Dog Day Afternoon, Roger Felberbaum, the first lieutenant to Hollywood banker Roy Furman, and Howard Baldwin, the owner of the Pittsburgh Penguins, who had recently produced David E. Kelley's very first screenplay, From the Hip. Each one of them told me that if I was serious about Hollywood, I should move to Los Angeles and get a job at one of the major talent agencies. They also each advised that I would be better off doing almost anything else with my life. Still, I'd felt that first rush of discovery. There was nothing really anyone could say at that point that would stop me from at least figuring that out on my own. That fall, I packed my car and took a solo trip, like Jack Kerouac himself, across the Great Plains of the United States. My dad, as I stood in the driveway about to climb into my packed car and drive off, asked me if I wanted to just hang around one more day, grab a sandwich, and play golf. Turning that offer down remains one of the hardest decisions I ever made. But I could see in that moment that if I said yes to that sandwich, I would say yes to tomorrow's sandwich, and on until I never left. I had to rip off the Band-Aid and go. I came to Los Angeles and started knocking on doors. Marty Bregman, true to his word, set me up at CAA, where I was told I would have to start as a runner, picking up the cut-up fruit and pastry every morning at 5:30 a.m. and delivering it to the various conference rooms around the HQ. Someday, if I was good, I'd graduate to the mailroom. Eventually, I might be lucky enough to become someone's assistant. It sounded like a lot of work for something I wasn't sure I wanted. Agenting. Calling Marty to tell him I was turning it down was brutal. He told me I was making a mistake, but I just had to trust my gut at that point. I had nowhere else to turn. UTA offered a similar opportunity, though the time frame was accelerated enough, it seemed worthwhile to throw my hat into the ring over there. But then I discovered WMA, where they were desperate enough for assistance you could skip the whole mailroom experience and go right to the learning part of working on an agent's desk. You couldn't become an agent that way, but you could get agency experience on your resume. Every producer wanted that. And start to build a network of contacts you'd have for the rest of your career. By the time I pulled up to the lobby of the Carlyle, I may have been unemployed, but I felt I had enough experience that I could see a future where I stood on my own 2 feet. I had at least learned enough about Hollywood that I knew this much. I knew more about it than my parents, so their skepticism over my decision to quit my job without first finding another job carried very little weight with me. It was, I realize now, a huge relief to feel I was the master of my own destiny, to not have their voices, however well-intentioned, second-guessing my decisions. I'm a great assistant, I explained to them. Hollywood needs people like me. I didn't know if it was true, but their inability to dispute me felt like the freedom I had craved. I was on my own. If I had any doubt I was on my own, my mother subsequently sent me a letter explaining that whatever choices I made, she and my stepfather would always support me. They loved and trusted me to chart a course that made sense to me. But I should also know that they would not support me financially. Like what other kind of support did they think I need? I didn't totally understand what was motivating the note. On some level, I think they were always terrified that I would become some dilettante, sitting in a house I couldn't afford, dreaming someday of picking up my pencil, ultimately becoming a burden to them. It was a real fear. I would have loved to have done that. On the other hand, there were throw pillows in their living room that cost more than it would take to cover my expenses for a year. I'm not even kidding. Also, full disclosure, this letter proved more bark than bite, as they have always come through for me with emotional advisory and yes, financial support when I have needed it, and sometimes when I haven't. But at the time, the message was clear. I better find myself a job. When I got back to Los Angeles and checked my bank account, I realized I had to find a job quickly. I could probably survive another month, but then things would start to get real. I decided I might have to lower my standards. Maybe I wasn't going to be able to find a chieftain to make my dreams come true. Maybe the journey would be more circuitous than I hoped. I deigned to take a couple interviews. I met at Palm Pictures, the production company founded by Chris Blackwell, the music impresario who brought Bob Marley into the mainstream. I didn't really like the vibe of the place, and what's more, they didn't offer me the job. I was rejected from a job at Trimark as well. I did have a very successful meeting with the preternaturally charming Brad Cravoy, who would later go on to run Orion. It seemed like he might offer me a job, but he operated in the lawless world of international co-productions and indie financing. I had visions of a film crew ducking bullets in a nascent revolution, while a runaway barge laden with all our film equipment floated untethered down the Chao Phraya River. I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of adventure. It was maybe more than I was bargaining for. I did eventually get offered one job. Before I had started William Morris, I had managed to snag an interview for an assistant job working for Gary Foster, producer of Sleepless in Seattle, and Lee Rich. Gary's brother Tim had been a classmate of mine at Georgetown, and he introduced me to his successful producer brother. I didn't actually meet with Gary, but he set me up with the assistant to his partner, Lee Rich. The assistant was an English lady in her early 60s who had that no-nonsense efficiency and dry wit that would have made her a layup to play Miss Moneypenny in any of the Bond films. She was direct and proper and told me that, among other things, my duties would include making Mr. Rich a very dry martini every day at precisely 4 p.m. What a world. I didn't get that job either, but Gary let me down easy and told me that if anything else came up, he'd give me a call. A year later, he did. Funny aside, I just met Gary for the very first time in person last week on his tennis court in Martha's Vineyard. The job he had on offer was to be a runner. This was before the time of email and internet, so urgent messages and packages were delivered all over Los Angeles by runners and messenger services. Some companies, especially those with a generous overhead deal, kept a runner on the payroll. It was one of the ways to break in. The pay was $10,000 a year. I thanked him and told him I'd think about it. Despite the fact that it was a shitty offer for a shitty job, it was amazing he had thought of me and had the, dare I say it, class to follow through. I called my parents and told them about the gig, and they suggested in the most emphatic of terms I accept the offer. I thought they might be right. The money was terrible, but I'd be on the Sony lot, the same glamorous lot that had once been owned by MGM, and was the setting for F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Last Tycoon. It might lead to something, but really there was no way. I had turned down a runner job when I had no experience at all. There was no way I could go from plotting how Bruce Willis might take a larger ownership stake in his passion projects to delivering packages around Los Angeles. I turned it down. There wasn't really anything my parents could do. A few days later, a job presented itself that miraculously met the criteria I had laid out. Mike Medavoy, the former chairman of TriStar Pictures, founding partner in Orion Pictures, was starting a new financing entity, Phoenix Pictures. If it came together, the company would make 20 movies over the next 5 years that would all be distributed by Sony Pictures Entertainment. Medavoy would be the chairman of the new entity. He was looking for an assistant. Medavoy had been Steven Spielberg's agent, Woody Allen's agent, Barbra Streisand's agent. When he was running United Artists, they had won umpteen Academy Awards. At Orion, they had done Platoon, Hoosiers, RoboCop, and Amadeus, to name a few. He was a real Hollywood mogul. It was the job I had dreamed I would get. What's more, he was a close friend and mentor to my former boss, Rick Hess. The stars were beginning to align. Still, I felt I needed to get the interview on my own so I could reserve Rick Hess's firepower to close the deal. I reached out to Mike's assistant, Laura Runnels, who would go on to become a successful TV writer and run shows like Spinning Out for Netflix. She was smart and funny and got me in to meet with Mike. The meeting went well enough. Mike had been an athletic guy, an avid tennis player, a charmer with a wry smile and a devious twinkle. He sat cloaked in a perpetual swirl of cigar smoke in a giant office on the top of the somewhat decrepit Frankovich building just off the Sony lot. He had a bit of a pinched, nasally voice and a shock of bright red hair. He sat behind a simple wood-carved desk with a single drawer and no files. It was meticulously clean. The office was big enough to house 2 sizable seating areas and a private bathroom. There was artwork everywhere. It wasn't quite the glamour I'd seen in The Player, but it was close. I wanted the job so badly, and I was terrified I'd blow the interview. But the only concern Mike raised with me was that he was worried I might quickly get bored. I seriously doubted that. William Morris had been a lot of things, but it was never boring. But how can you answer that question? I just promised, no matter what happened, I would stay for at least a year. That seemed to satisfy him. When I got back to my apartment, I immediately called Rick Hess. He called Mike, and a day or so later, I was back in for a second interview. Oddly, I shared the elevator up to the second meeting with none other than Brad Cravoy. What a small world Hollywood was. I don't know what he was doing there, but he pressed me not to take the job with Mike because Medavoy hadn't closed his financing yet. It felt great to have 2 people vying for my services, but there was no way I was going to turn down Mike, despite the precarious financing, to hold out for whatever Brad had on offer. Little did I realize how often the financing for a film studio fell apart. That possibility never even really occurred to me. I was worried the second meeting might be something like a deeper dive into my cinematic lexicon, which was pretty scant. I didn't really watch movies growing up. My father told me that if the weather was nice out, I should be out playing golf. If the weather was not, I should be inside drinking with friends. My film knowledge was limited to the crash course in movies I'd given myself over the summer before I left for Los Angeles. And I made a list of favorite films and favorite directors and rehearsed my pitch about my love of storytelling. But it turned out the second meeting was purely ceremonial. Hollywood was ritualistic back then. You had to observe the rites. I was ushered back in front of Mike's desk and he told me straight up I had the job. The pay was $550 a week. It was almost $30,000 a year. It was twice what I was making at William Morris and 3 times what Gary Foster had offered. I would start on Monday. My parents took the news well. Sure, they'd been annoyed by my process, but they'd been rooting for me the whole time, and I'd proved my point. For good or ill, I don't think they ever offered me career advice again.